share my screen?
Sure will.
Thanks.
Uno momento. Let's see. Nate.
Yes, there we go. Screen of, oh God, okay, there we go. Hopefully it's this one. Yay! Everybody seeing the big picture there? More importantly, oh God, okay, hang on. Here we go. Yeah, we can move it ahead. There we go. Does everybody see screen and things moving?
I do.
Good. Okay, so
Yeah.
background, a little bit of background on why why I decided to mix up crisis and measurement. One thing is that every year at the IPRC, about 50% of the research is focused on crises because there's a lot of data there. So there was some interesting, if you read the news next week, the newsletter will come out with some of the IPRC research about crisis. But that was sort of one thing that was going on. The other thing that was going on was there's a lot of crises going on. Jan, earlier you mentioned Flint. There we have a local one where very interesting situation where Phillips Exeter Academy, very prestigious local prep school, is had to fire, well, officially let go one of its favorite professors who turns out had been molesting people over the years, and now all kinds of other things are going on with Exeter. So there's a lot of crisis in the air. And it occurred to me that most people get sort of freaked out about crisis when in fact crisis measurement is very simple and measurement is very useful in a crisis. I think there's probably some folks on the line that we don't know, and maybe if you wanted to anybody there have a Sherry or Brent or anybody have a particular, August, do you want to introduce yourself and tell me if there's anything specific on your mind before I ramble on?
Hey Katie, it's Brent. I'll jump in. I'm Brent Diggins with Allison and Partners, where I head up measurement and analytics, and just interested in learning, what we can do before, during, and after generally a crisis, just to make sure we measure it well.
Great. Anybody else got a specific thing? Then we'll just keep on going. So rules for crisis measurement. The first thing that everybody kind of forgets about is when you're putting together your crisis plan, there really does have to be at least a monitoring component of it. And most people who have very detailed plans do have some monitoring going on. But one of the things that I was sort of looking back over all those years of writing about crisis for PR News, one of the big things that seems to have been a trend or a frequent habit, I guess, is that these crisis plans go together and somehow they forget that things happen in social without happening in traditional media. So if there was ever a reason to merge social and traditional media monitoring, a crisis is it, because an awful lot of things explode in social without ever reaching, I mean, God forbid, if it starts in social and gets to mainstream media, then it's a real crisis. A lot of things can be quickly dealt with in social without getting to mainstream media, and if by the time it hits mainstream media, it's all over social anyway. So you kind of can't separate one from the other during a crisis. So the first thing is be prepared and have data at hand, which I'll get into the specifics in a minute. Okay, let's go back to where is my, there we go. So have a plan and make sure you have a listening system in place. Rule number 2, as I said, I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, but so the rough overview is the real objective in it. We talk so much about objectives being the basis of any measurement program, well, the crisis measurement objectives are pretty simple. It's get it over with as soon as possible, and I'll talk a little bit about, how you know whether that's working or not. The other big lesson, and this comes partly out of the IPRC research as well as just our own experience and from analyzing these things for almost 20 years, is you've got to respond in the media in which it started. The classic bad example of that is the Susan G. Komen Foundation, where the whole thing exploded on Twitter. And 3 days later, Komen responded with a perfectly dreadful YouTube video. And you see this a lot where people will go to YouTube, and yes, YouTube is an effective thing, but it is not necessarily the most effective thing. If you've got a crisis going on Twitter, you got to respond in Twitter. If the crisis is going on Facebook, you've got to respond there. You can't just sort of not respond at all and then suddenly come up with a response in some other medium, because people are going to expect you to respond where they first heard about it. The research from IPRC says over and over and over again that authenticity is the key. That people are more likely to forgive you faster if you're authentic. Your employees are more likely to believe you. There's a wonderful piece called the megaphoning effect, where you get your employees to basically pick up your message and echo them for you. That's much more likely to happen if you are authentic. And authenticity beats certainty. It even beats, the next piece is translucency versus transparency.
Katie, may I
Yep.
interrupt? Could you please say a little bit more about the difference between authenticity and certainty?
Yes. Certainty is I'm going to wait until the lawyers and the scientists and everybody else tell me all the facts. Authenticity is, I don't know. Here's what we got going on. And this goes back to translucency versus transparency. The beauty, what translucency is you're saying as much as you possibly can. Think of a bathroom screen there where you know there's something there, but you don't see all of the details. So often in a crisis, you don't have the details. They emerge over time. Especially some of these sexual harassment things where, something happens and then more people come forward. But even, Flint, Michigan, rather than saying no or yes, yes, it happened, no, it didn't happen, you share as much information as you possibly can, as authentically as you possibly can. Some of the most effective apologies and mitigation effects, look at Netflix, right? They're first to say, you know what, we screwed up. Starbucks is another one where they're very willing to say, we screwed up. That kind of authenticity is saying, you know what, we made a mistake. Yeah, but we probably didn't research everything. Is just talking like a normal human being instead of saying, I am the spokesperson and I have to be certain about everything. Now, I know that this gets into a big fight with lawyers frequently, but the truth is the fact that it's going to cost you a lot more if the crisis continues. And so translucency versus transparency, the example that was used in the research was that if you look at the Malaysia flight, what they did in the beginning was not to say anything because they weren't certain. Nobody was certain. Then when they got pressure to release more data, they dumped it, right? They just dumped everything. And it didn't work. It backfired because there was so much data. People didn't necessarily believe it, and it sort of started a whole nother round of speculation that they were dumping information to obscure things. So if you can dribble out information as it comes, as you've got it available, that actually works better than just dumping a whole bunch of data out there. And most importantly of all, as always, it's that kick butt index. To what extent are you, going to be able to answer the question to your senior leadership of, are we getting our butts kicked or are we really kicking butt? what is reasonable to expect in a crisis. You're not going to get positive coverage necessarily, but if you can keep the negatives to a minimum, if you can get your messages out there, that should be considered a victory, and that should be the goal. But you have to be very clear about what the expectations are. The other advantage of having measurement in a crisis is you can learn from your mistakes, because you're going to be recording this stuff. You're going to be reporting on a regular basis, so the next time something happens, you're going to know what worked and what didn't work. Let's go on to the next one. So in terms of realistic objectives, there's, as always, there are three types of objectives. One is actual outcomes and behavior. And so a reasonable, smart objective for a crisis might be minimize loss of customers or minimize loss of revenue. In terms of perceptions, minimize changes in a reputation, minimize change in trust or in relationships. In outputs and activities, these are the easy things. These are what most people do measure in crises, which is, have I kept my share of negatives relative to my peers to a minimum? Now, this is especially true when you've got an industry that gets a lot of negative press anyway. You know, is yours worse than anybody else's, right? So if you're Comcast, are you getting any worse coverage than Verizon? Defense companies do this all the time because they just figure that they're going to get some negative press, and they look at their share of negatives, of all the negative stuff out there that's happening. To what extent is are they getting the negatives? You know, if you look at Flint, to what extent is the emergency manager getting negative press versus the EPA, since they're both getting hit at the same time? Obviously, you want to minimize the total amount of exposure. One of the things that I look at in my image patrol column is I grade them on, you know, total exposure. So when I Google it and it shows up in 57 international publications as well as, you know, 1 million other places, that's not a very good job of minimizing the exposure. A lot of times you can't help it, but if it's at all possible, that is a measure of success. Did we keep it under control? Did we keep it, if it's a local crisis, did we keep it local? Or am I now the butt of a, you know, late night comedy show? When things hit the late night comedy shows, that's when I start giving them an F for exposure, actually. And realistically, did your point of view or your messages get out there? That really is a critical piece of this. Is in the middle of a crisis, the best you can do sometimes is to simply get your side of the story out there, but you need to be tracking that so you know, in fact, are you getting your side of the message, side of the story out there? So how do you be prepared, right? How do you, in terms of those rules, what can you do? Well, first of all, you listen everywhere. As I mentioned, social forums, local blogs. Forums are something that I've been studying since about 1995, and nobody pays much attention. But when you're looking at investor forums, that's where an awful lot of the rumors are floating around, where you can, people are picking up and planting rumors about companies and hoping to pump up the stock or drop the stock. So it's important to listen to those on a regular basis, because if you only listen to them during a crisis, you have no idea whether it's a crisis, you know, whether the conversation is unexpectedly negative, right? So if you have a chart that says, okay, forums have been 20% negative for 3 months and now they're 50% negative, that's a problem. If you've got a chart that says they're 20% negative the same way they've been for the last 6 months, it's not really a problem in forums. And the same thing is true for Twitter or Facebook or mainstream media or anything else. You have to have that benchmark to know how bad it really is. one of the other things, I know most people, understand the necessity of a crisis plan, but what very few organizations do is rehearse it regularly. And I learned this actually from the phone company. And the question is always, when the power goes out, how is it that the phone company doesn't? Well, you can still use your phone. This is the old days of landlines. Well, I was in the Northridge earthquake, and I happened to have a sales call coming up with the phone company folks. I think at the time it was Pacific Telesis, believe it or not, and they were a client, and I couldn't get out of LA to get to San Francisco in time for this meeting, and I was trying to get a hold of them or whatever, and they answered the phone, and I said, how is it that you're working and nobody else in LA is? And they said, we rehearse our crisis plan once a month. And we have it all set up and everybody's remote and blah, 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 blah. They went through the whole thing. And that's because they knew what to do, and it works because once a month they actually rehearse their crisis plan. And making sure that part of your crisis plan is obviously a big piece of it. The other important piece is, and not a lot of people do this often enough, but is to have some kind of trust measurement. And whether it's the Element Trust Barometer, if you're part of that, or whether you're just doing your own surveys after events, understanding of the extent to which your stakeholders trust you is really important, because if you know that 75% of them trust you before a crisis and you test them afterwards and 75% still trust you, I would argue that that's not a big problem, that that the crisis hasn't had any impact. One of the best examples of that, IBM did this. I don't know how many remember this, but during the Atlanta Olympics, I think it was Atlanta, IBM had just implemented a major new, it was the first time they rolled out a truly integrated networking system, and they had the contract, they were the sponsor for all of the communications at the Olympics. And a week before the Olympics, they were due to turn the whole thing on, and it didn't work. And the press went nuts. Ha, 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 IBM did this whole thing and it doesn't work, blah, 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 blah. IBM's message was, actually, it all does work. It just, we didn't actually, was the media center. So they got that message to customers directly. They tried to get it out in the media and did research that showed that it was doing it overnight on a regular basis. They had a benchmark, but then they were doing it every night. And they asked the customers who bought this stuff what they thought of what they thought of IBM. Did they still trust them? And the overwhelming response was, sure. Who cares about the press anyway? I'm impressed that you got a system that big and up and running in a week anyway. So helping to having benchmarks and keeping track of things like trust and reputation is a really effective way to show that your management of a crisis is working or not. And that's the importance of having a benchmark, so you understand how bad it really is. Now, the other piece of crisis measurement that people seem to forget in the heat of these things is you got to focus on the outcomes. And some of you may have already heard me tell the story, but I'll start with the first one, which is the National Wildlife Federation. Had this whole thing to raise awareness of water buffalo, and one of National Wildlife's big things is to preserve habitat for endangered species, and so they had this whole campaign. They got the water buffalo. They got a thing on Conan O'Brien, brought the water buffalo on, and in that picture, as you can see, Conan O'Brien is trying to get on the water buffalo. Water buffaloes are normally very peaceful. This one didn't particularly like Conan O'Brien very much and threw him off. The segment was canceled, and then the next night, Conan talked about it and asked the audience if they wanted to see his bruise, at which point he dropped trow and showed these enormous purple bruise. So what I think the National Wildlife people did, right? They freaked. They said, oh my God, it's a native crisis, it's a native crisis. I'm in there trying to develop measurements and metrics for them. And the guy who arranged this thing said, you know, how do you measure the negative stuff? And I said, well, tell me what the negative was. So he told me this whole story. Because we were doing a measurement design project, the web analytics person was in the room, turned to her and said, can you tell me what the numbers were for web traffic, subscriptions, and registrations for your newsletter were, and traffic to the wildlife preservation page were during the hours of whatever it was, 9 o'clock on the night before and 2 days afterwards. Well, they broke all records. They got more subscriptions, they got more registrations, they got more people to their website than any time in the last year. So the question is that a crisis? Right? If the outcome is all good, is it still a crisis? And I would argue that many, many, many PR people would say, yes, it's still a crisis, and most business people would say, nah, don't worry about it. Same thing is true on the other case, which was, and this was a manufactured one, where JustDoSomething.org is an organization that tries to get teenagers involved in good deeds. And in this case, they were trying to get teenagers to take pictures of abandoned pets in shelters, because there's a statistic that says that if there's a picture, people are much more likely to adopt them. So they were trying to get more pets adopted. To promote it, they brought puppies on board on the Good Morning America show. And the host drops a puppy on its head in live television. This was a video, you'd see it, it's quite funny. Puppy was fine. Puppy didn't care. What's her face there just completely freaked out. It went viral with, shall we say, some help from some PR people at DoSomething.org. Did they care that it went viral? No. What they cared about, when I was giving a speech, I was watching them, and I went in there afterwards. They were looking at their web analytics, counting the number of people who were signing up to take pictures for pets. Right? So what they did was they created the crisis and counted the outcome in live real time. And that, you know, that's to me is the ultimate in good crisis measurement. Crisis can happen. You know, the best thing you can possibly do, here we go, let's get these in the right order here. If it's a self-inflicted crisis, something you did, it's probably the fault of bad management, a bad CEO, or bad relationships. Somewhere along the line it's your fault. And the only thing you can do in that case is to apologize abjectly, right? Take action, follow up, change something, tell people you did that, and keep on apologizing. There's a lot of research. Tim Coombs is a fabulous guy who can tell you all of this stuff, but this sort of summarizes most of the crisis research out there. If it's an accidental crisis like weather or terror or, you know, some governmental action that you have no control over, again, it goes back to translucency. Share as much information as possible. Don't just dump data out there, and whatever you do, don't blame anybody else. I don't care if it's the fault of your supplier. I don't care if it's the fault of anybody else. Do not make anything sound like you're blaming anybody else. It's guaranteed suicide, and I've analyzed so many crises now, and every single time the CEO says, well, it's not my fault, or it's somebody else's fault, or even seems to point a finger at somebody, it gets worse. And whether it's a partner or anybody else. Now, these are the two charts that, let's go put all of them there. This is kind of the lesson, right? These are very, very old. At the time we had the data, I haven't bothered updating them because I think it's still true. What happens is that when you have a crisis, and that's all these charts are showing is volume, right? So the volume of coverage. The first one was the Intel Pentium chip. Second one was layoffs at a major hospital chain. In both cases, on the left-hand side, those red ones, they did not tell the truth. They were not translucent. They tried to hold it in. They tried to manage it. They tried to blame. Intel basically said, oh, well, it's not a problem for regular consumers. It's only nerds. Columbia basically said, we may think we might have some layoffs. We might have some layoffs. Maybe we're going to have, it's just a rumor. We're not really going to have layoffs. And then they finally did. What happens in that case is that the crisis is perpetuated. It just keeps on going until something changes. In Odwalla, which was a organic fruit company, tiny little company, and they killed somebody with their unpasteurized apple juice, right? And they came out, they said, we're sorry, they changed all their processes, and essentially the crisis was over in about 2 weeks. Nabisco was another one. Nabisco was found not to have as many chips and Chips Ahoy as were on the outside of their bags. And pretty much everybody thought it was pretty funny, and they addressed it. They were very frank about it, and the crisis was pretty much gone. And this is the pattern. I've seen it over and over again. But this is, again, the reason why you have measurement in place to know if it's going in the right direction. So how do you set up a measurement program? It's still about defining your objectives, defining your parameters, most importantly, prioritizing who matters, right? Not everybody matters, right? Not everybody on Twitter matters. What matters is employees, customers, shareholders, your neighbors. Make sure you've got them and you've got the relationships measured ahead of time and then measured afterwards. And where do you fit in that process? Make sure you have some benchmark or something so you know whether you've succeeded. Turn on your measurement system and then analyze it. So, I've worked with clients where we're looking at things, every few hours to see what's working and what's not working. The other thing now with automation is very easy to do. If you put a press release out there, it's pretty easy to see whether or not it's being picked up and are they picking up your key messages. Years ago, when it wasn't that easy to do, we analyzed a sort of merger crisis story and found that, yeah, the first one, a lot of messages picked up. Second one, press was still interested, a lot of messages picked up. By the third press release, nobody paid any attention. So the endless press release thing isn't as effective as it used to be. And most importantly, you've got benchmarks so that you know whether it's good or bad, right? So have you handled it well or better than anybody else? There are lots of industry stuff out there. There's a ton of research information. A lot of it is on our Measurement Central page. We're on research you can use. But essentially, what you should be doing from benchmarking is keep track of whatever keeps your C-suite up and your board up at night in the middle of this stuff. Also look at your place in the market. Don't just look at yourself. Everybody gets very myopic in the middle of a crisis, but you really do need to look at what's going on. There's another wonderful paper at IPRC that looked at the salmonella in peanuts crisis, big food issue. And even though regular Jif and Skippy peanut butter wasn't at all effective, it was basically an a different use of peanuts, and the peanuts that were found weren't used in any of these things. The organization, and I can't remember whether you can read the paper and find out, but I believe it was Jif was very proactive, and they didn't lose market share. And the other competitors basically left everything up to the industry association, the Peanut Council of America, and they all suffered losses in market share. So, in that case, by listening to what else was going on, they knew they had to do something. They knew where they were in the marketplace. And so measure your market if you can, and then measure your change in relationships, not just perceptions. So just as an example, I thought we could sort of walk through these, but this is a framework that those of you who have been on the call before know that, if you start out with a goal like minimizing media attention and maintaining customer trust, what role does communication play? And these are questions you need to get answers from, either from your clients or from senior leadership. You know, you need to know in their mind what communications role is. You know, in this case, coordinating stuff with the media, or managing the spokespeople, or responding on social media in terms of getting the word out there and hopefully quelling it and keeping it to a minimum. You know, crafting statements and counseling leadership and all of those things. Well, that's the role of communications. You need activity measures to know whether you're doing a good job, right? So that might be the percentage of news items that contain a key message, or drop off in coverage, or it might be you know, decline in volume of news coverage per day. Those are activity metrics. Ultimately, you're going to measure the outcomes, which is either share of negatives, or rankings on trust, or you know, a minimize decline in customer renewals. That's the real measure. And to measure that, you need tools, right? So pretty much some form of media analysis and social listening for the first one, for the media piece of it. And then for trust, you're going to have some kind of a survey or CRM system so that you understand what your customers are thinking and doing. And that's it. And that still gives us quite a lot of time for questions. So fire away.
Are there any particular tools you like for real-time monitoring?
I am a big fan of CyberAlert because I know those guys pretty well. I think there's a reality to all kinds of Twitter. Frankly, Hootsuite and Twitter, to me, are as real time as it gets. Most of the traditional media monitoring stuff, you know, CyberAlert included, certainly everybody else, there are delays, and it's not their fault. It's a fault of how it's fault of the aggregators, the people that are pulling the stuff, and restrictions that the publishers put on them. So, for example, the Honolulu Advertiser, right? It comes out at, I don't know, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. It's published in Hawaii. The only people who get to read it at 6 o'clock in the morning Hawaii time are paid subscribers. Online or in print, doesn't matter. So until noon, I can't get a hold of that, no matter who my aggregator is, right? Unless I've got somebody in Hawaii looking for me, who happens to be, or unless I'm a subscriber. So the vast majority of aggregators out there do have some restrictions, so it's not necessarily going to be real time. And I just, frankly, for real time stuff, I'm looking at Twitter. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, Katie.
Brent, do you have any that you like?
It depends. You know, there's a couple that I've used before that, you know, sort of, and I just use them for crisis. One is Signal Labs with a Z.
Yep, they're good.
They try, I mean, they really, you know, have a nice dashboard that pulls in things, you know, full-time. I don't have a full-time subscription, but when I've had a crisis or two in the past, I've engaged them.
Yeah, it's tough because, I mean, and you know, I've had crisis breaking and the client, you know, screaming that we were using NetBase and CyberAlert at the time. And what happens is, you know, things are, it just happens, right? I mean, you're going to miss things by 40 minutes or something. And the client, for whatever reason, the client will find it on Google News Alert before you do.
That's always the worst.
It's just life. It's just life. It just happens. You know, I don't know whether it's their Google search or what, but it does happen. So there's nothing is perfect, I guess, is the answer. Do we have
Hi,
other?
Katie.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Angus Keeley, from ResCon. We met in Calgary
Yes,
in
absolutely.
October.
Yeah,
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Oops.
Appreciate the presentation. It was really helpful. Got a kind of a, I guess this is sort of a strange question for, it might seem strange, I don't know, but I was going to see what you thought about in terms of the length of time that you think it might take to create a strong crisis management plan.
Brent might have more experience in that than I do. Well, I think it doesn't take very long to create it. Getting it approved,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, you can pick, not to be facetious, but there's a lot of them out there. I mean, I don't know whether Jim Lukashevsky has them published, but there's a lot of them out there. You can pick them up and get them, you know, and adapt them to you fairly quickly. The issue is, can you get it approved by legal and IR and the CEO, and how long does that take? And that has to do with, you know, internal support and, you know, politics and all kinds of other things, unfortunately. But I mean, in terms of the other thing that I hugely recommend and talk to, oh, I just spaced on her name, having a dark website, having a website ready to go in a crisis. And I know that is it Business Wire? Business Wire does that very, very well. And the person that does it is, it'll come to me as soon as I'm off the phone, I'm sure. Anyway, they have a very good system. I'm a big fan of having, you know, a dark website ready to go in a crisis, because I think that that speeds up the whole response time. And even if you never use it, hey, it's there, it's ready to go, you never know. And that may be, you know, that may be easier to get approved than a full round of crisis planning.
Is there any plan that you would point to as a really good example that people should try to build off of?
That I haven't actually looked for one. There are certain people whose work I trust, and I'm sure I've seen them. I mean, so there's a couple things. One is Jim Lukashevsky, L-U, Luka, L-U, see, I'd have to, hang on, let me see if I can find him. I think it's, this is what I was afraid of, don't do that. Here we go. If you Google crisis plan, I think he's the first guy to come up. Come on. There's another piece of this too, that Lukashevsky. Let me just try this. I have no idea. There he is. Lukaszewski. Let me just see if he's got anything ready to go. There's another guy called Dirk Van Eden who's amazing. And what Dirk Van Eden taught me about crisis preparedness, he taught me the business about what else is going on in the industry and who are the influencers. And I will tell you that there was a breaking crisis that we got involved in with him, and he called me on a Friday night. By Monday morning, he wanted a list of everybody who was influential on this particular issue. We then set up a monitoring system to monitor the issue. There's a particular scientific development. We set that up, but we set it up to monitor because the fear was that it was going to become a political issue, So we looked at that particular crisis term in conjunction with, and I kid you not, Ted Cruz, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, the Pope, Obama, whoever happened to be Speaker of House at the time. But basically what he, you know, and it was a complete waste of time. Nobody talked about it at that point, and he and his client were able to step in and change the conversation. But he taught me to really think outside the box when you're setting up these things, and make sure you think beyond just, okay, it's me and the peers. No, who else could make hay from this crisis? In this case, it was, I mean, think stem cell research, but it wasn't. But I mean, if you think about, there's some poor scientist inventing stem cell stuff, and the next thing you know, it's the heart of the abortion debate. That's the kind of thinking that a good plan will come up with, is to think about, okay, who else is going to make hay off of my crisis? Therefore, who do I have to neutralize? And how can I position things in a way that might get us out of here a little easier? The other thing he done is so changing the issue. There was another issue we worked with him on, that was drug pricing, right? And very hot topic these days. So we obviously had a monitor set up for drug pricing, but we also had a monitor set up for drug access, and who was talking about having access to drugs and why that was important, and what was the cost-benefit analysis of widening access to drugs. And didn't totally win that one, but from a measurement perspective, it was a very interesting lesson to look way beyond the way you would normally think.
Okay.
Wait a minute, hang on a second. So let me just see if he's got anything. He doesn't, actually, Jim doesn't, well, he's got a lot of resources on his page about, your quick guide to the crisis communications management process. Let me see. Well, you know what? We'll put that in the follow-up. Aaron, I'll give that to you, and we'll give that to you as a follow-up link.
Oh, fantastic. That's right. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
What's your recommended cadence on the like post-crisis surveys? Are you looking at a week, a month, or for the trust survey or brand awareness?
Oh, I wouldn't wait. Well, I guess it depends. I mean, you kind of want to do that when it depends on the length of the crisis and what's going on, obviously. IBM did it right in the middle of it to find out how bad it was, one way of doing it. And you may want to do that. You may want to do a very, a relatively small sample survey to say, okay, how bad is this really? I generally think about a week after something. After that, it does really fade from mind. But then, the other side of that is, we were called in. There was a very negative piece on sludge treatment that aired on some Texas television show. I have no idea what it was, but anyway, we got hired by the owners of the television program that were being sued for defamation and loss of business and everything else by the sludge management company. And by the time it got to court, obviously it was months and months and months later. At that time, we did a survey to see whether anybody felt badly about the sludge company, and nobody even remembered it. A, nobody had watched it, and B, those who had watched it didn't remember it. So that is a sort of a lesson to all of us, which is, unless it's something, the longer it's in the news, the longer people are going to remember it. If it's out of the news, and you do a survey, a month later, good news is probably people will have moved on unless, Flint's not going to go away anytime soon. BP oil spill not going to go away. A lot of these things too, we're communications weirdos. We remember all these things because they're hot communications topics, and I remember them because people study them and present them for 3 days in March every year. The average Joe Schmo consumer is not necessarily going to remember every single crisis that's out there. And look at Chipotle. Chipotle is a perfect example of, hey, I don't care. I still like to eat at Chipotle. They certainly their store traffic is down, but is that, if you asked a week into the crisis, would people say, are you going to avoid it? Yes, some would say. A month later, that's going to go down. So it depends what you're trying to, at what point you're trying to really take the pulse.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry I couldn't be more definitive, but it does sort of depend upon what you're trying to show.
Yeah, exactly.
No more questions? Yeah?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Angus again. I know
Yeah.
this is, maybe this is going to sound repetitive, but I guess I'm kind of thinking about in the minds of, let's say, of our office, for example, if a crisis should occur, what would you say is the best way to explain how the crisis is being measured? Instead of, would it be typical to say, okay, there's only 3 stories today as opposed to, let's say, there were 18 on Friday, or?
I would, as much as it sounds silly, I would put it in a chart, nice little area chart saying, here it's going down. See this line? It's, it was up here and now it's down. Just do it in a chart. Business people respond to charts and visuals. Everybody today responds to charts and visuals. So I would do it that way. I would also try to, as part of your plan or, part of your prep, get everybody to agree that, okay, the fastest, most immediate measure of our success is to keep coverage to a minimum. So what we're going to do is we're going to track coverage in, these publications. So there's 2 ways of doing it. You just say, okay, I'm just going to see how many mentions there are on Google, or you've got a real system set up that says, okay, within the parameters of what we're tracking, day 1 there were 100 stories, day 2 there were 80, day 3 there were 70, day 4 there were 20. That's our definition of success. Everybody agree? Any objections? No. And then somebody is going to say, well, what about the long-term effects, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's long-term, but you need to know in the heat of it, in the heat of that moment, you do need some feedback that says, okay, is this working? Which is the other reason why I would take a sample of those clips, certainly the ones from the most influential publications, and read them for messages if you're not already. But make sure that somebody is consistently reading these things for your messages to see if the messages are getting out there. Because the second thing I would do is to say, you know what, we know that we're, more or less keeping a lid on this thing, but the good news is we're getting our messages out there. And again, that sort of has to be agreed upon up front as to what the messages are, and if that's a good thing. But for the most part, I think if management sees that their point of view is getting out there at all, it's a pretty good thing in the middle of the crisis. If you go back to Chipotle, their message is clean and fresh foods, and they care about safety and everything else. That message came across, right? So you could argue that it wasn't a total disaster, I guess. That's another example where, it's not a it's so hard because I'm sure they're very much restricted in terms of what they can and cannot say by the FDA and the feds and everybody else. And that's the other side of this, is that there's an awful lot of things you won't be able to do and won't be able to say. So you have to, that's where you have to come up with alternative acceptable proxies for measurement. If, for example, the FDA won't let you say something, or the authorities don't let you say something, then then the best you can possibly hope for is a balanced story. And I consider a balanced story desirable. So you might look at desirable versus undesirable press and keep that in mind, that you're not really looking for positive and neutral. What you're really looking for is balanced.
Terrific. Thank you.
Welcome. Any last thoughts? I think we'll call it a wrap. Have a great day, everybody.
And this is Erin. I will be sending up a follow-up email tomorrow with Katie's slide deck and the resources that she referenced. So have a wonderful Wednesday. See you next month.
Bye-bye. See you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.